Good afternoon to you. It is the Chris Baker radio program here at News Radio 1110 KFAB. In this hour, joining us on the show is Corey Saylor from the Council on American-Islamic Relations. Corey, welcome to the Chris Baker Show.
Hey, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
Well, I appreciate you coming on with us today. Well, first of all, there's a report from CAIR and UC Berkeley talking about Islamophobia, and I'd like to get into some of the nuts and bolts of this report. First of all, what is Islamophobia?
So CAIR defines Islamophobia as closed-minded prejudice against Islam or Muslims. And the closed-minded in that definition is what's key to me. I'm talking about people who, after 9/11, decided they know everything they need to know about Islam. End of discussion.
Mm-hmm. And what are the consequences of this? Because I'm not really seeing any of them. I know that there have been, are mentioned in your release here, is anti-Islamic laws or anti-Muslim laws. What are some of those?
So 10 states at this point in time have passed laws with the deliberate intent to vilify Islam. Most of the time what they do is they simply say we're going to ban foreign law in the legislation. That's how they get around the First Amendment. But then when you look at the conversations, it's all about how we have to protect this country from Islam, we have to protect this country from Sharia. In the one state where they did actually pass a bill that specifically targeted Sharia within the text of the legislation, we sued them, upholding the Constitution on First Amendment grounds, and the courts in the Oklahoma area, which are not known as liberal courts, ended up agreeing with us and struck the law down as unconstitutional.
Mm-hmm. And can Sharia exist with a representative republic or democracy?
Without a doubt. Just as Catholics and people of the Jewish faith like to be able to have contracts within their own faith tradition, so do Muslims, but any contract that you have within your faith tradition has to adhere to U.S. law.
Mm-hmm. Mentioned are 33 Islamophobic groups, and it says they have access to $205 million in total revenue.
33 organizations around the United States, what we call the inner core of the U.S. Islamophobia network, used that much money to spread fear and hate of Islam between 2008 and 2013. So instead of using this money to do something positive, these groups are using it to spread fear and prejudice. They're spreading lies about what Muslims believe. They're spreading conspiracy theories about what Muslims are doing in this country. So go to Islamophobia.org today, get a copy of our new report, Confronting Fear, learn more about these groups. More importantly, we want you to learn more about what you can do to help push back against their fear and prejudice.
First of all, what's the complaint on that, and doesn't that coincide with free speech?
Well, absolutely free speech. And nowhere in my report will you find me suggesting that these groups should not be free under the law to do and say what they want to do.
Mm-hmm.
So welcome to a democracy. What I would suggest, though, is that these groups should be relegated to the fringes of any political discussion, just like anti-Semites and white supremacists. They have the right to say what they want to say. We will uphold the First Amendment. But I don't think anybody should take their biased ideas seriously. When we're talking about, so what is the complaint against these groups? It goes back to that point that I was making about closed-minded prejudice. These are not groups that are generally talking about having specific concerns with the Islamic faith. These are people who broad brush all of Islam, broad brush all of Muslims, and insinuate that all of us are a threat to this country, which is absolutely ridiculous.
Well, see, I've seen it actually the opposite. I have not seen a broad brush. I've seen people talk about Islamic terrorism, but what I've seen is the political class on the left use the broad brush in order to try to discredit people who seem to be bringing legitimate concerns about security and safety.
So let me give you two immediate recent examples of broad brush attacks. Donald Trump has called for a ban on all Muslims coming to the United States. When you look at the press release he issued in December, he cited in the text of that press release the Center for Security Policy, one of the 33 groups that we named, and cites a poll of theirs that has actually been thoroughly debunked by academic institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Again, second part to that broad brush is Donald Trump's call for profiling of all Muslims. These are anti-constitutional suggestions. In the United States, we do not accept the notion that you take an entire class of people based on faith, Catholics, for example, who used to be the target of these kind of things, and single them out. That's just not what we believe in this country.
But when it comes to terrorism, I mean, these are people that are speaking of terrorism. They're not just speaking of average, everyday people. They're talking about terrorism, and I think that, especially with the recent record, why is that not a legitimate concern?
So they're not. So Trump's proposal is not ban all terrorists from the country. Nobody has an argument with that. It's ban all Muslims. That's broad brush. And let's talk about the terrorists for a moment. I prefer to call them devils. I'm a person of faith, and their ideology that they advance looks nothing like anything other than something inspired by the devil. So ISIS recently issued a list of Western Muslim leaders that it wants to see dead, a hit list. Featuring prominently on that hit list was my boss, the executive director of the Council on American-Islamic Relations.
Yes.
So I would suggest to you that something we're doing is really upsetting them, right? Somebody in Syria doesn't notice a group in the United States unless what you're doing is having an impact on the insidious plans they're trying to advance. So we're capable of having two separate conversations, one in which we push back against the horrific, barbaric ideology of groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. At the same time, we talk about something that we in this country have been fighting for many, many years, and that is bias against minority groups. Used to be, Jews are still one of the number one targets of such bias. When Mitt Romney was running for president, I remember doing a CNN interview in which I had to defend him because he was a Mormon, and people were accusing him of that he would let the Mormon church run the country if he became president. So the bias being shown toward us is the same thing we've seen. Unfortunately, there are many great things about America, but we have had to struggle with bias towards minorities. Same thing, just a new target.
Mm-hmm. You said there are 33 Islamophobic groups. Who are some of the greatest offenders?
So we already talked a little bit about the Center for Security Policy. They are one of the groups that I point to, A, through Donald Trump's press release, B, Ted Cruz appointed 3 of their staff to his National Security Advisory Council, as groups that have really made it into the mainstream. Another well-known organization, Act for America. The head of that institution believes that no Muslim can be a loyal, patriotic American citizen, which is completely counteracted by any trip to Arlington Memorial Cemetery where you will see Muslims who have died serving their nation.
Okay. What about individuals? I mean, I know there's talk hosts on this list. Some of them I know personally. I've never known them to be any kind of phobic. They're all very good people. I mean, how do you decide who gets to come on this list and who doesn't?
The list is the result of us going through 25,000 news articles over the last 3 years, looking at tax return, over 500 tax returns, and examining the websites and just listening to the broad trends of discussions of the organizations. We tend to name organizations rather than individuals of those that we've named. And at the end of the day, what we concluded with the groups we put on the list is we see enough frequency of use of anti-Islam tropes that they deserve to be named. It deserves to be pointed out. Yeah. And happy to have a discussion to end those tropes.
Mm-hmm. I notice a website I look at quite a bit, the Clarion Project. They seem to be pretty equal. I mean, they talk about peaceful Muslims who believe in human rights, and then they talk about terrorists. How do they get on the list?
They're well known for producing anti-Muslim propaganda films. As a matter of fact, the New York Police Department at one point in time was showing one of their films. Then when it was reviewed by senior leadership, they rejected it. I believe the term wacky was the actual part of the quote, senior NYPD person. Mm-hmm. When you look at the films, imagine if you took every criminal in the United States and cut them into one 10-minute YouTube video and projected that to the world and said, this is what America is. You know that's a lie. I know that's a lie.
Yeah.
That's essentially what Clarion does. Clarion Fund does for Muslims. Or Clarion Project, as it's known now.
We're talking with Corey Saylor with the Council on American-Islamic Relations. Ryan, do you think that you guys are dishonest there at the Clarion Project? Or Clarion
No, we have
Institute?
3 Muslims on the board. I've provided information to the authorities about anti-Muslim threats. So I would just like to ask Corey, why is it that CAIR spends more time attacking people like me and the Muslims that we work with, like in our film Honor Diaries, than the amount of time they spend attacking anti-gay laws in Muslim countries and anti-gay movements like the Muslim Brotherhood? Why is the attention directed on us and not on things like homophobia in the Islamic world and other forms of extremism?
So let me just point out that I was not told that there would be another guest on this segment.
Yeah.
And I'll answer the question, but that's just really objectionable. That's very unprofessional practice, and you know that.
Yeah.
As I already said earlier in the interview, we're adults and we're quite capable of focusing on many things at once. And we have called out violent extremist groups. We are not a foreign policy organization, so I don't spend a whole lot of time in my professional life talking about some of the things that I object to that I see coming from Muslim countries. Saudi Arabia's ban on women driving, I think that's ridiculous, and there's nothing in Islam to support that. But given, and as you well know, you have seen the statements coming out of CAIR. You have seen that we signed on to a letter to the head of ISIS, completely deconstructing his understanding of Islam and inviting them to return to the actual faith. So I think the notion that we spend more time attacking Islamophobic groups is just completely inappropriate.
And their Muslim partners. And you guys do talk about foreign policy a lot. As for that letter against ISIS, I've read it, and it endorses Sharia theocracy and the Hudud punishment. So it's not exactly this great moderate declaration. But real quick, and then I'll let you go on. But there is one quote I'd like you to respond to.
Well, hang on. Let Ryan ask his question because, because Corey, I know that Clarion gets attacked, yet, I mean, that's why I wanted Ryan to be here too, because that's the most fair website that deals with extremist and peaceful-loving people. I don't understand why this guy's being attacked.
So be a balanced host. Let him answer my question, because he asked me one, which I answered, and then he can come back and ask another question.
Sure, go ahead.
Be a fair host.
Well, I'm right here. Okay. All right, Ryan, go ahead.
Sure. I was just wondering how Corey would respond to the 2007 court filing by federal prosecutors, which reads, from its founding by Muslim Brotherhood leaders, CAIR conspired with other affiliates of the Muslim Brotherhood to support terrorists. The conspirators agreed to use deception to conceal from the American public their connections to terrorists. So is that true, or is the Justice Department also part of the Islamophobia network? And then also if he could address the fact that a 2011 Gallup poll shows that only 12% of Muslim Americans picked CAIR as the group that most represents them. So why do so few Muslim Americans choose CAIR as the group that represents them?
Sure. So let me just point out that he completely dodged the question that I asked him. So that
I didn't even
tells
hear
you
it,
about
but you can restate it if you'd like.
So in my answer to the questions that you asked is, and you know this, is that whole thing was put to bed in 2011. So there was a court ruling that CAIR had been named as an unindicted co-conspirator in a trial. There was a court ruling that naming was inappropriate for another organization, and thus all of the other groups that were included in that class. Eric Holder was asked specifically about CAIR, and he responded, when you look at the facts in the law, there's nothing there. He was attacked for that because somehow people thought we had influence over Holder. So James Jacks, the prosecutor in the case that had named us an unindicted co-conspirator, came out and also said, when you look at the facts in the law, there's nothing there to prosecute. That's not a direct quote. So that was 2011. So I have no idea why 5 years later, issue dealt with, you're still pushing it. So let's go back to my original question. When the New York Police Department calls your films wacky, what do you think that says about the level of your production?
I think our production is very well, and I think that they were responding to political pressure and mischaracterizations of the content of the film. There was a lot of political pressure as a result of what your organization was saying about the film, which is narrated by a devout practicing Muslim. And as for the unindicted co-conspirator list, actually what happened was that the judge ruled that they should not have disclosed the names on that list, but that their CAIR's belonging on that list was upheld because of, quote, ample evidence linking them to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. And that also doesn't bear upon the 2007 court filing that I quoted.
So the other part to that is quite simple. In the post-9/11 era, every Muslim institution has been subjected to significant scrutiny. And if we had jaywalked, I guarantee you we would be in jail at this point in time. So what you're arguing is that somehow a organization with a $5 million a year budget, which is a joke by D.C. standards, good for the Muslim community, but very small by D.C. standards, somehow is able to influence the entire Justice Department. I think what it actually says is what Holder pointed out, that there had been reviews under both the Bush administration and the Obama administration, and they found there was nothing there. So we'll continue operating and upholding our First Amendment right. You talk about...
Well, I was citing the Justice Department, so I didn't say that you control the Justice Department.
By a Muslim, and I don't question at all Dr. Jasser's commitment to, his practice of Islam. However, when there was a law in Oklahoma, which we talked about earlier in this interview, that specifically targeted Islam for vilification in violation of the First Amendment, as ruled by upper courts in the Oklahoma area, he welcomed that law. So you're still talking about a man who has adopted anti-constitutional positions, whereas CAIR, on the other hand, our lawsuits in that case were squarely aimed at upholding the Constitution. So you can
but
throw
that's
all
a
the
disagreement.
money you
That's
want
not
to
Islamophobic
at the end of the day,
bigotry.
We're on the front line of defending
there's
American
disagreement,
democracy,
and then there's
and
accusing
you're on the
someone of
front line
bigotry and
making
being a horrible
propaganda
person. And so why is it that it's so questionable? It's so you have such protests over getting money from this so-called Islamophobia network, but then it's acceptable for your organization to solicit money from places like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and Muammar Gaddafi when he was alive.
Our organization is primarily domestically funded. If we asked for any money overseas, it was completely in line with the law. And if I remember correctly, it was pointed out that Clarion Project, Clarion Fund at the time, was essentially a front group for a group named Aisha Torah, which is based overseas. So not a whole lot of credibility.
No, that's not true, but I don't think even if it was true, are you really equating Israel with places like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and Muammar Gaddafi? I mean, if your standard for outrage is getting money from the Islamophobia network and allegedly from Israel, which isn't true, but that's your standard, why are you outraged over that, but not over getting money from these other places that are known state sponsors of terrorism and human rights abusers?
As I said, we, like many other places, have at times sought funds from overseas. You mentioned Iran. I don't remember any attempts there, but I certainly do remember that when there were 2 American hikers detained in that country, our executive director was among a delegation that went there to help secure their release. And we were told that that delegation had a significant impact on securing the release of those hikers. So you might want to look at the good work we've done rather than continuing to throw mud at the wall and seeing what's going to stick.
Hey, there's been things that you've done that I've said that I like that CAIR does. I think when there are legitimate acts of anti-Muslim bigotry, any voice that speaks up about that is very important, especially considering the fact that ISIS has said that they want to trigger anti-Muslim sentiment. But then when you go out and you start attacking organizations like my own and you go beyond saying we disagree, but you are part of a conspiratorial Islamophobia network, you are bigots, part of a network. That, I think, is really uncalled for, particularly when you go after Muslims. I still didn't quite get an answer to the question, and I understand that there was a lot to address, but I'll just ask it again. The 2011 Gallup poll that shows that only 12% of Muslim Americans chose CAIR as the group that most represents them. So is it really fair for CAIR to talk as if they are the gatekeepers and the leaders of the Muslim American community when only 12% say CAIR's the group that represents us? And the majority of them don't know about the documented links to groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas or one of your officials suggesting that we shouldn't honor fallen soldiers on Memorial Day.
So once again, there's a lot of allegations there, and I'll just address the core one, the poll. What that poll did was ask people which Muslim organization they felt best represented them. And when you combined the results, CAIR was the number one group by a very wide margin. You can combine the next three institutions together, and it still doesn't equal up to what CAIR, the support to CAIR received. So you will not see CAIR saying we speak for all Muslims. We say we are a representative organization of the Muslim community, and we're very proud that among all the organizations, when asked, Muslims picked our institution as the most favored one. If you think people aren't aware of the allegations against us, I think you're dead wrong. It's all very, very public, as are our stances on many, many positive things. But what I would point out to you is the Muslim community is very well aware that minority groups like ours have a history of being vilified in this country. We are not in any way, shape, or form equivalent to Martin Luther King, but he was placed under surveillance and called a communist. So if so great a figure in the United States as Martin Luther King can have it asserted about him that he's a threat to the country, what about a small organization like ours? But when you look at the sum total of our work is about making democracy work for everyone. And when you look at the lawsuits that we file, they are consistently about upholding the Constitution. Last point I'm going to make, and then I have to go, because, again, I really find it unfortunate that another guest was thrust on me in a very unprofessional manner. But last point, one of our staff did say she questioned honoring American soldiers on Memorial Day. That's her opinion. Many other people, we have veterans within our organization who are proud veterans. I regularly tweet out my thanks to soldiers for their service to the country. So I find it very interesting that one person says something and you hold that up as the standard for the whole organization, whereas there's an entire body of evidence.
Was it condemned?
It's been talked about internally as policy, but I'm not going to condemn somebody else's free speech in that case. What I am going to do is...
But wait a minute, CAIR condemns other people's free speech. Why wouldn't you condemn the free speech, so to speak, of a person who says don't honor soldiers?
My free speech in that moment was to thank our soldiers for their service to our country, regardless of their political beliefs, regardless of their faith or lack of faith. And I think that's the appropriate thing to do.
Why isn't that a fireable offense, though? Why would you keep her? I mean, you guys give her a reward. You give her a platform.
What my colleague was trying to do was assert her concerns about the use of our armed forces overseas. And I think that is a legitimate thing to ask about. Many Americans wonder why our nation invaded Iraq for the second time, and many of us think that that was not the best use of our troops. That was not the best idea to put our young men and women in harm's way in a country that had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks. And really, in many ways, the result of that has been chaos in that area that continues to affect our country. So, given that
she was making our soldiers sound like murderers, though, Corey. I mean, it was really nasty depictions. I was looking at the tweets, and so you guys do give her a platform. If I did that, I would have been fired. I mean, why don't you fire her or distance yourself from her? But instead, she's still a star. She's one of the stars of your group.
Endorses free speech. But I would say you just heard my explanation. In that entire explanation, which I don't hear you challenging, all you do is you say murderers, right? You try to boil it down to one thing.
Well, she said that about American soldiers. Yeah, that is offensive.
And the problem is you can't have nuanced and complex discussions on Twitter. So that's a good long interview. It's almost 30 minutes. I appreciate the opportunity. Once again, I will say it's deeply unprofessional to ambush somebody with.
But it doesn't. Well, but I mean, it doesn't make sense that people are. I mean, I've seen CAIR call for people to be removed, fired for things that they've said, and then a member of CAIR makes a controversial statement about American soldiers, and there's no condemnation. Nobody says a word. So you don't think that's...
I'm not going to discuss what our internal conversations were. You don't know what they were.
Well, but it's not about internal...
But it was a public statement, though.
Yeah, it's not about internal conversations. It's about public statements. and credibility within the citizens.
I'm still waiting for you to acknowledge that I just said we've put out a number of alternate statements to that through official channels, not through somebody's personal Twitter, through official channels. Videos showing people from within the CAIR organization who have served in the United States Armed Forces and done so honorably and proud of that. So.
All right. Well,
so
real
it's
quick,
time to
Corey,
take
on
the
Fox
total
News,
body
why did you struggle with the question of condemning Hamas and Hezbollah?
Many so-called moderate Muslim leaders have been convicted on terror-related charges. To be fair, on their website, CAIR has condemned Al-Qaeda by name. But why won't they condemn Hamas or Hezbollah?
And you sit here now and in just one sentence tell me CAIR condemns Hamas and CAIR condemns Hezbollah.
I'm telling you in a very clear fashion, CAIR condemns terrorist acts, whoever commits them, wherever they commit them, whenever they commit them.
That's not the same thing as saying you condemn Hamas and you condemn Hezbollah.
Well, I recognize that you don't like my answer to the question.
Real quick, Corey, on Fox News, why did you struggle with the question of condemning Hamas and Hezbollah? That clip that's been out there, that's really awkward to watch.
Okay. Well, I think I've given you fair time given the ambush.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, thank you.
We gave him plenty of time to talk, but I do appreciate Corey staying on and not hanging up. So that's a contribution.
Well, thank you, Corey. All right, he gave us the Brad Ashford. All right, well, Ryan Mauro, I'm not going to let that guy smear my friend. That's all. That's what this is all about. You've been the most fair guy in any of these discussions, and I'm not going to stand by and let some group smear somebody. All right, and not let you be not represented in this conversation. So.
Thank you so much. And we let him speak. I don't feel that we didn't talk over him too much, except for when the point was already made. So I think that was one of the better dialogue that is out there, one of the more fair ones. And you shouldn't need a lot of preparation to handle those type of questions that have been out there for a long time. I think an ambush is a bit of a dramatic answer.
Oh, it's okay. It's ambush. I don't care. Whatever. All right. Well, Ryan, take care, man. And I appreciate you. I'm glad you could be with us today.